By the summer of 1941, Adolf Hitler appeared to stand at the zenith of his power. To the world, he seemed one of those rare historical figures whose ambitions unfolded with astonishing ease. In 1936, he reoccupied the Rhineland without firing a shot. 2 years later, he annexed Austria and a large part of Czechoslovakia. When the inevitable conflict finally erupted in 1939, Germany, under his leadership, crushed Poland in mere weeks. The ensuing period of relative calm, dubbed the Phony War, gave way in the spring of 1940 to the swift collapse of Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, and France. By the summer of 1941, German forces had also secured the Balkans. Virtually all of Europe, from Spain to the Soviet frontier, lay under Hitler's iron grip. Yet how did this seemingly invincible ruler lose everything and end his life by suicide in a Berlin bunker? Let us examine some of the most critical miscalculations that sealed Hitler's fate in the Second World War. At the heart of Hitler's downfall lay his uncompromising and rigid political ideology. As Clausewitz famously observed, war is merely the continuation of politics by other means. But for Hitler, this principle took an extreme form. He viewed the Second World War not only as rightful redress for Germany's defeat in the First World War, but also as the vehicle through which the German people would fulfill their supposed racial destiny, the eradication of both Jews and communism, which he believed to be merely a manifestation of Jewish influence. In an unpublished sequel to Mein Kampf, Hitler repeatedly referred to communism as Jewish Bolshevism and described the Soviet Union as Jewish Bolshevik Russia. Given these convictions, it is unsurprising that the Soviet Union he had accepted the 1939 non-aggression pact with Stalin only as a temporary expedient to secure victory in the West and avoid a two-front war like the one that had doomed Germany in 1914 to 1918. Yet his ultimate geopolitical aim remained the destruction and conquest of the Soviet Union. To Hitler, the USSR represented not just the epicenter of Jewish Bolshevism, but also vast, fertile territory ideally suited for German colonization once Jews and communists had been eliminated. This was the doctrine of Lebensraum, living space, the belief that ethnic Germans must displace the Slavic populations of Eastern Europe and Russia. As the German population grew, Hitler reasoned, it would require more land, and he intended to seize it by force. The concept of Lebensraum originated in 1901 with the writings of German geographer Friedrich Ratzel. Ratzel argued that every nation must be self-sufficient in resources and territory to defend itself effectively against external threats. Influenced by Darwin's theory of natural selection, Ratzel and his followers believed nations were locked in perpetual struggle for survival, and only the fittest would expand and thrive. For ethnic Germans, the lands of Eastern Europe were thus a biological necessity. The idea gained traction during the First World War, when Germany temporarily occupied large swaths of the East and established a military administration known as Ober-Ost. The indigenous peoples under Ober-Ost were treated as a reservoir of land and resources, while German culture was forcibly imposed upon them, a policy termed Kulturmission, cultural mission. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in early 1918 granted Germany vast territories far beyond Ober-Ost's original scope. But Germany's defeat later that year shattered these ambitions. Hitler never forgot this experience. He remained convinced that Germany's future Meta-Pause 6 2.0. Thus, rather than consolidating his gains at the height of his power, he deemed it imperative to invade the Soviet Union. For deeply ideological and historical reasons, he believed Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union could not coexist. One had to perish. This conviction led to his greatest strategic blunder, though far from his only one. The manner in which Hitler planned and executed Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, proved equally disastrous. He achieved total surprise when, on 22 June 1941, German artillery opened fire on unsuspecting Soviet troops. Yet, the timing itself was a critical error. Originally scheduled for May, the invasion was delayed until late June because Hitler had to intervene in the Balkans after his ally Benito Mussolini suffered humiliating defeats. Although the Balkan campaign succeeded, it cost him a precious month, a delay that would prove decisive. Initially, Barbarossa appeared a stunning success. German forces demonstrated their mastery of mobile warfare, encircling hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers in massive pockets. For a time, it seemed Hitler's vision of a lightning campaign across the vast Soviet plains might succeed as brilliantly as it had in Western Europe. Yet here, Hitler committed what may have been his most significant operational mistake. Instead of pressing forward toward Moscow, a drive that was advancing rapidly, he ordered the splitting of Army Group Center. He diverted key forces to reinforce Army Groups North and South, which were advancing toward Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, and Ukraine, respectively. On 21 August, he issued a directive prioritizing the capture of the Crimean Peninsula and Ukraine, economically vital regions, over the advance on the Soviet capital. His generals vehemently opposed the Meta-Pause, Sex 2.0. Though German troops continued to win battles, these were tactical victories that masked a strategic failure. When Hitler finally resumed the drive on Moscow in early October, he had already lost a crucial month. By early December, German units stood just 12 miles from the city. A reconnaissance patrol even reached within 5 miles. But this marked the high water mark of the German advance. On December 5th, the Soviets launched a massive counter-offensive that drove the overstretched and undersupplied German forces back 150 miles from the capital and industrial heartland of the USSR. By failing to take Moscow when he had the chance, Hitler ensured he would never do so, and that the Soviet Union would remain in the war. He ruthlessly dismissed any general who dared suggest tactical retreat during this critical phase. Others, fearing dismissal or worse, ceased to challenge his decisions, no matter how irrational. Consequently, Hitler assumed ever greater personal control over the German military, making himself responsible for an expanding array of operational choices. This centralization of command was another fatal error, one whose consequences became starkly evident the following year. Although the German army suffered its first major defeat in late 1941, it was far from exhausted by early one. With his declaration of war against the United States in December 1941, Hitler now faced the very scenario that had destroyed Imperial Germany, a two-front war. Victory over the Soviet Union thus became more urgent than ever. Yet, instead of renewing a full-scale assault on Moscow, Hitler again fixated on the southern front. His new objective was to seize the oil fields of the Caucasus. Once more, he launched his offensive relatively late in the campaign season, stretching his supply lines to the breaking point. He also deemed it essential to capture Stalingrad. Given the city's name, both Hitler and Stalin imbued it with outsized political symbolism. Perhaps as a psychological coping mechanism, Hitler convinced himself that Soviet forces were exhausted, a belief that proved another costly delusion. By November 1942, the German Sixth Army had seized most of Stalingrad. But then, the Soviets launched Operation Uranus, aiming to encircle the city. When General Friedrich Paulus requested permission to withdraw and save his army, Hitler refused, insisting the troops must stand and fight for every inch of ground. The result was the encirclement of 300,000 German soldiers. A relief attempt led by Field Marshal Erich von Manstein failed. He had only a small strike force of about 50,000 men. And area resupply, promised by Luftwaffe Chief Hermann Göring, proved impossible. Meanwhile, without Hitler's authorization, Paulus refused to break out and link up with Manstein. In February 1943, the entire Sixth Army surrendered. Stalingrad became the turning point of the war. Germany lost some of its finest soldiers and officers, irreplaceable losses. The Wehrmacht could no longer mount strategic offensives on the Eastern Front, a reality confirmed later that year during the Battle of Kursk, when Operation Citadel collapsed in failure. By invading the Soviet Union out of ideological obsession, Hitler had jeopardized the vast empire he had built. His failure to destroy the USSR when he had the chance guaranteed a slow but inexorable decline from the pinnacle of power. Yet Hitler's errors extended far beyond the Eastern Front. By mid-1943, the United States and Britain had expelled Nazi forces from North Africa and launched an invasion of Europe via Sicily, advancing up the Italian peninsula. This shift in momentum forced Hitler to divert resources westward, ending any hope of winning the war before. By late 1943, it was clear the Allies planned to breach the Atlantic Wall, a chain of fortifications stretching from Norway to the Spanish border, and strike at the heart of Nazi-occupied Europe. In Führer Directive No. 51, Hitler explained his reasoning. While the vast expanses of the East allowed Germany to absorb territorial losses without existential risk, the Western Front was different. A successful Allied breakthrough there would bring catastrophic and rapid consequences. All signs pointed to an imminent invasion, no later than spring, possibly sooner. Therefore, further weakening the Western defenses for the sake of other theaters was unacceptable. Reinforcements were ordered, especially in areas deemed critical for launching long-range attacks against Britain, precisely where Hitler believed the decisive battle would unfold. By this stage, despite worsening military realities, Hitler's confidence in his own military genius had only grown. He continued to centralize command, a tendency that inadvertently aided Allied deception efforts. The command structure of German forces in the West was paradoxically fragmented. Not all armored units answered to the theater commander, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt. Some belonged to Panzergroup West, led by General Leo Geier von Schweppenburg, who, though nominally subordinate to Rundstedt, also reported directly to Hitler. Thus, any deployment of the feared panzer divisions required Hitler's personal approval. The Allies understood that if they could deceive Hitler about the true invasion site, half their battle would be won. The confused command structure on the Western Front only reinforced this strategy. Long before D-Day, Hitler's indecision over panzer deployment, stemming from his insistence on Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, tasked with strengthening the Atlantic Wall, argued that armored divisions must be positioned near the beaches to annihilate Allied troops as they landed. Rundstedt disagreed, favoring a more flexible reserve strategy. When Rommel bypassed Rundstedt and appealed directly to Hitler, the Führer, unwilling to choose, attempted to please both. Rommel received 3 panzer divisions, 4 remained under Panzer Group West, and 3 were assigned to Army Group G, south of the Loire, also under Rundstedt's nominal command. As a result, on D-Day, Germany's best mobile forces were disastrously dispersed, with some stationed far from the invasion zone in a sector of negligible strategic importance. This was not Hitler's only blunder during the Normandy campaign. Allied deception operations, most notably Operation Fortitude, exploited the very logic outlined in Hitler's Directive Number 51. Since only a few locations offered viable conditions for a large-scale amphibious landing, the Allies focused their deception on convincing Hitler that the main invasion would come at the Pas de Calais, not Normandy. And Hitler, blinded by ideology and overconfidence, fell for it. The Allies' plan was to convince Hitler that the invasion would target Calais, the closest point across the English Channel. To reinforce this illusion, they created a fictitious formation, the 1st United States Army Group, FUSAG, which was to be commanded by General George S. Patton, widely regarded as one of the Allies' finest field commanders. The most famous element of this deception involved inflatable tanks, trucks, artillery pieces, and other military equipment visible to German aerial reconnaissance. But this was only the beginning. Carefully orchestrated fake radio transmissions were broadcast, counterfeit documents were prepared, and troops were permitted to troop movements were meticulously choreographed to suggest that Calais was the true objective. To further bolster the ruse, by this time, nearly all Nazi spies in Britain had been captured and turned into double agents under the Double Cross program. The most remarkable of these agents was Juan Pujol Garcia, a Spanish citizen codenamed Garbo. Unlike others, Garcia had originally intended to spy against Nazi Germany. After the British initially rejected his offer, he contacted the Germans, only to later reveal himself voluntarily and become a double agent for British intelligence. Garcia fabricated an entire network of 27 sub-agents, each equipped with highly detailed, plausible backstories. Through scrupulous attention to such details, and others, he and his imaginary network flooded the German high command with intelligence they believed credible, even when it was technically accurate, as it was often rendered useless by timing or context. This modus operandi dated back to 1942, when Garcia provided the Germans with just enough truthful details about Operation Torch landings to establish his credibility. The success of the D-Day landings on June 6th was only the first step toward breaching the Atlantic Wall and liberating Western Europe from Nazi control. Once ashore, the Allies needed to convince Hitler that the Normandy landings were merely a diversion, and that the real invasion was still to come at Calais. It was critical to prevent the Nazis from committing their full strength, especially their panzer divisions, to Normandy. Otherwise, the invasion might be driven back into the sea. On June 5th, Garcia sent his German handlers a warning that an urgent message would follow in the early hours of June 6th. He intended to report detailed intelligence confirming an imminent assault on Calais. But the radio operator This lapse allowed Garcia to relay more accurate information about the Normandy landings than the Allies had originally planned, though, as usual, it arrived too late for the Germans to act effectively. Garcia further cemented his credibility by expressing indignation. "I cannot accept excuses or negligence. Were it not for my ideals, I would abandon this work." Then, on June 9th, he informed the German High Command that the true invasion was still pending at Calais, backing his claim with forged documents that purported to reveal the elaborate structure of the FUSAG-led invasion plan under Patton. For Hitler, who had long believed Calais was the most likely invasion site, these reports were especially persuasive, as they appeared to validate his own military judgment. Field Marshal von Rundstedt was equally deceived. As a result, only a handful of tanks were deployed against the Allies during the critical early phase of Operation Overlord. On 29 July, nearly 2 months after D-Day, Hitler awarded Garcia the Iron Cross for his exceptional service to Germany. Even in August, numerous German forces, including 2 panzer divisions and 19 infantry divisions, remained stationed at Calais, awaiting an invasion that would never come. By then, it was far too late for the Nazis to push the Allies back into the Channel. Hitler's unwarranted self-confidence as a military leader and the chaotic command structure that reflected it cost him the chance to prevent the Allies from breaking through the Atlantic Wall and opening a 2-front war. Ironically, Hitler had been right about one thing. His earlier warning in Führer Directive No. 51 had come true. Yet his last gamble, the Battle of the Bulge in December and January, ended in failure. Less than a year after D-Day, Hitler shot himself in his Berlin bunker as Soviet forces, whose invasion he had so confidently dismissed, closed in on his position. This trait may even drive their initial quest for power. Once in control, however, megalomania tends to intensify. In Hitler's case, the combination of an already unstable personality, a grandiose millenarian ideology, and absolute dictatorial authority created the perfect conditions for self-destructive decisions made without informed criticism. Competent subordinates feared speaking up, lest they be dismissed, or worse. Adolf Hitler was far from the only dictator, before or since, to exhibit this pattern of behavior. But he remains the most infamous, not only for the war and genocide he unleashed, but also for the catastrophic strategic blunders he made in waging it. In numerous instances, Hitler could have averted defeat by choosing differently, but time and again he chose wrongly. On June 22, 1941, in the early hours of the morning, German shells rained down on the Brest fortress, reducing barracks to rubble and cutting off radio communications. Red Army soldiers, emerging from clouds of dust and making their way into shattered bunkers, found themselves completely encircled, cut off from command and facing vastly superior enemy forces. Despite this, they fought with unwavering determination. While fortress defenders withstood relentless assaults from aircraft, artillery, and flamethrowers, Soviet civilians risked their lives to deliver ammunition, and nurses braved enemy fire to drag the wounded off the battlefield. Graffiti scrawled on the fortress walls, "I am dying, but I will not surrender," became a powerful symbol of their indomitable spirit and desperate resistance. In the months leading up to that tragic June of 1941, the Soviet Union appeared to be at peace with Nazi Germany. The two powers had signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in August 1939. Secret protocols of this agreement stipulated the division of Eastern Europe between them, while the public non-aggression clause allowed Germany to focus its military efforts on its Western allies. For Stalin, the pact was a calculated strategic move. He believed it would sow discord among Western capitalist powers, weakening their positions and, more importantly, buy the USSR valuable time to strengthen its military might. Seizing the opportunity, the Soviet Union moved beyond Poland to annex the Baltic states, Bessarabia, and northern Bukovina, significantly expanding its borders. Yet this expansion fostered a false sense of strategic security. Behind the scenes, however, intelligence reports carried alarming news. Soviet agents, border guards, and even foreign diplomats warned of growing German troop concentrations along the western frontier. He suspected the British of spreading disinformation to drag the USSR into war, and clung to Hitler's assurances that the massive German troop movements near the Soviet border were merely intended to keep aircraft out of range of British bombers. Even when the GRU and NKVD presented irrefutable evidence, troop concentrations and intercepted communications, Stalin dismissed much of it. Hitler himself had even sent Stalin a letter claiming that any German provocations would be the work of disloyal generals, urging Stalin not to respond with force, but instead to contact German officials through diplomatic channels. This reluctance to believe an invasion was imminent also stemmed from Stalin's profound distrust of his own military intelligence. The Great Purge of the late 1930s had decimated the Red Army and state security apparatus. Thousands of experienced officers, including most of the high command, had been dismissed, imprisoned, or executed. By 1941, a staggering 75% of Red Army officers had held their posts for less than a year. Experience had been replaced by obedience and fear, as a cautious and disoriented military hierarchy hesitated to deliver unwelcome news that might anger Stalin. Compounding these issues were serious flaws in Soviet deployment. The annexation of eastern Poland and the Baltics had shifted the USSR's western border 160 to 400 kilometers westward. Many fortifications along the old border were now obsolete, while Soviet divisions stationed in newly occupied territories were dangerously exposed. Airfields, barracks, and command centers lay vulnerable to immediate attack, as construction of new defensive positions had been delayed or cancelled altogether. Worse still, the Red Army lacked a deep defense system. Rather than deploying forces in echelons, with successive fallback lines and strategic reserves, many Soviet units were This meant that any German breakthrough of the initial defensive line would encounter little resistance beyond it. These defensive shortcomings were not taken seriously, largely due to prevailing Soviet military doctrine at the time. The Red Army in 1941 was structured primarily for offensive operations, reflecting the belief that any future war would involve subduing neighboring states. Much of this confidence stemmed from the USSR's vast tank inventory. The brand new T-34 and KV tanks were among the best in the world, but they constituted only a small fraction of Soviet armored forces. The overwhelming majority consisted of obsolete, mechanically unreliable models like the T-26 and BT series. Thousands of these tanks were rendered inoperable due to a lack of radios, spare parts, recovery vehicles, and trained mechanics. Numerical superiority meant little without logistics or a robust support network. The Soviet Air Force faced similar problems. On paper, Stalin's air fleet was the largest in the world, but this quantitative edge masked serious qualitative weaknesses. The backbone of its fighter force consisted of outdated Polikarpov 115, Chaika, and 116 Ishak aircraft. Though effective in the Spanish Civil War and against the Japanese at Khalkhin Gol, they were now outclassed by the Luftwaffe's Messerschmitt Bf-109s. At dawn on June 22, 1941, as the first rays of sunlight broke over the horizon, the illusion of peace shattered amidst the thunder of war. Without warning, across a staggering 2,900-kilometer front, the Wehrmacht unleashed its full might against Soviet positions. Artillery barrages shook the earth, while wave after wave of Luftwaffe bombers filled the skies, crossing the border in relentless formations. Airfields, barracks, and supply. On that fateful day, the Soviet Air Force suffered catastrophic losses. Between 1,800 and 2,000 aircraft destroyed, many while still on the ground, never given a chance to take off. One pilot later recalled, "I pulled back the tent flap and saw planes with German crosses strafing our tents. Everyone rushed out and saw the dead and wounded in the neighboring tents. I threw on my flight suit, grabbed my logbook, and ran toward the hangar. The alert aircraft, neatly lined up, were already burning. The Red Army was caught completely off guard. Border units, lacking proper preparation or retreat plans, became easy prey. Communications collapsed within the first hours, leaving headquarters scrambling to grasp the situation, let alone respond effectively. Entire divisions lost command, or were encircled before they could even assemble. In the Kremlin, an ominous silence reigned. For nearly half a day, Stalin issued no official orders. Despite numerous warnings, his anti-capitalist paranoia, skillfully exploited by Hitler, led him to believe reports of German attacks were provocations designed to sabotage the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. On the front lines, initiative among officers was paralyzed. Years of purges had left the officer corps cautious and fragmented, unwilling to act without explicit directives from above. As the invasion deepened into Soviet territory, commanders faced an agonizing dilemma: resist or wait for confirmation. General Rodion Malinovsky later recalled asking, "Can we open fire if the enemy invades our territory?" The reply, "Do not succumb to provocations and do not open fire." Yet even amid the chaos, pockets of Soviet resistance flared. One of the first serious obstacles for the Germans, Germany's 45th Infantry Division, expected to capture the complex within hours, but instead became mired in brutal close-quarters fighting, cut off from command and deprived of clear orders. The fortress defenders, turning its ruins into a labyrinth of improvised strongpoints, were joined by nurses and civilians. With no hope of reinforcement, they heroically held out for 8 days against artillery, flamethrowers, and airstrikes. Further north, in Lithuania, the Soviet 2nd Tank Division launched a desperate counterattack against the German 6th Panzer Division east of Raseiniai. Most Soviet tanks were quickly destroyed, but some heavy KV-2s inflicted significant damage on lighter German panzers. In one notable episode, a single KV-2 cut off a critical German supply route, holding it for nearly 2 days. Its crew withstood everything, from anti-tank guns and artillery to satchel charges, before the tank was finally disabled. Though isolated, this action proved that, when properly employed, Soviet armor could outmatch the Germans tactically. Back in the Kremlin, the silence persisted. For hours after the invasion began, no official directives were issued. Stalin, overwhelmed by indecision, remained convinced the massive assault was merely a provocation by rogue German generals. He continued forbidding his commanders from crossing the border and ordered them to avoid any action that might escalate tensions. Even as German divisions flooded Soviet territory, Stalin kept trying to reach Berlin by phone, convinced Hitler would rein in his army. Eventually, Stalin began to confront reality, but remained absent from public view. He tasked Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov with delivering the state's official announcement. In a radio address on the afternoon of 22nd June, Molotov declared that the next day, Stalin quietly convened the Politburo and issued his first concrete orders: the creation of the Stavka, the general headquarters, under Marshal Semyon Timoshenko. Defensive lines were drawn. The Soviet Union was now fully at war. In the weeks that followed, the Soviet Western Front desperately tried to halt the German blitzkrieg, but the Red Army's disorganized defense nearly led to total collapse. Massive encirclements at Bialystok and Minsk trapped 4 entire armies. By July 9th, over 341,000 Soviet troops had been killed, gone missing, or taken prisoner. Material losses included thousands of tanks, artillery pieces, and aircraft. The situation in the south was no better. By early August, German and Romanian forces had advanced deep into Ukraine, reaching the Dnieper River and trapping 2 more Soviet armies in the Uman pocket. By early August, the situation along the Eastern Front remained dire. Behind the front lines, where the Luftwaffe reigned supreme, Soviet infrastructure suffered relentless bombardment. Factories, supply depots, and critical transportation hubs were devastated by continuous air raids. The few surviving rail lines became clogged with retreating troops, streams of refugees, and broken-down equipment, creating unimaginable chaos. Ammunition depots and airfields under enemy fire had to be abandoned in haste. The scale of the catastrophe forced the Soviet state to launch an unprecedented emergency operation. Key industrial plants were dismantled and evacuated eastward by rail. Even under constant German air attacks, the Soviets managed to relocate their industry beyond the reach of advancing troops. The increased distance from the front lines gave Soviet factories the breathing room needed to ramp up production of vital war material, ammunition, vehicles, and aircraft. In the Kremlin, Soviet leadership gradually. After 10 days of public silence, Stalin finally addressed the nation by radio on the 3rd of July. Gone was the language of diplomacy. Abandoning his formal tone as General Secretary, he called on citizens to defend the motherland, form partisan detachments behind enemy lines, and prepare for a long, brutal war. A month later, Stalin quietly assumed the role of Supreme Commander-in-Chief. As the Red Army began achieving more successes on the battlefield, Stalin's public profile grew. As Supreme Commander, he placed the defense of the entire USSR squarely on his shoulders. By mid-July, the Red Army was exhausted and bleeding, but not broken. As German forces advanced toward Moscow, the Soviets managed to stabilize the front enough to halt their advance near Smolensk. From early July, Marshal Timoshenko threw every available resource into stopping the German breakthrough. By month's end, Army Group Center succeeded in encircling the city and several Soviet field armies, but at a heavy cost. Not only did significant numbers of troops from the 19th and 20th armies break through back to Soviet lines, but the delay disrupted the German timetable for Operation Barbarossa, further straining their already fragile logistics. By late August, the Red Army was ready to strike back. West of Smolensk, Soviet forces under General Georgy Zhukov launched a successful counteroffensive near the town of Yelnya. Though costly and of limited strategic value, the operation provided a crucial morale boost. It marked the first time Soviet troops had forced the Germans into retreat. While major battles raged along the main front, resistance also began to coalesce in occupied territories. In the forests and villages of Belarus, Ukraine, and Western Russia, isolated soldiers, political officers, armed with little more than determination and minimal support, these early partisan units sabotaged railways, ambushed convoys, and carried out assassinations before vanishing back into the woods. By late summer, coordination with the NKVD improved, and partisan detachments became more structured and integrated into broader NKVD operations. Though they couldn't stop the German advance, their actions forced the Wehrmacht and SS to divert precious resources to secure rear areas, further straining German supply lines. Meanwhile, other branches of Soviet intelligence worked quietly in the shadows. Cryptanalysts of the NKVD under Sergei Tolstov successfully decrypted Japanese diplomatic communications, leading Soviet leadership to conclude that Japan would not attack the USSR. Meanwhile, Red Army codebreakers began intercepting messages exchanged between the Romanian High Command and General Erich von Manstein's forces in Ukraine, providing a broader understanding of the strategic situation. By late summer 1941, frontline Soviet commanders reported an unexpected shift in German activity. Armored units that had been advancing directly toward Moscow were diverting north and south. The Soviet High Command realized the Germans were no longer focused solely on the Central Front. In the south, Red Army commanders warned of a massive buildup of enemy forces targeting Kiev, but Stalin refused to authorize a retreat. Instead, the Southwestern Front mounted a valiant yet ultimately futile defense of Ukraine, resulting in its encirclement and destruction. Total losses amounted to nearly 760,000 men, with over 486,000 killed or missing. General Mikhail Kirponos, commander of the Southwestern Front, also perished in combat. Despite these catastrophic losses, while the Southern Front collapsed, the Central Sector remained quiet, granting the Soviets precious time to form new armies, regroup their defenses, and continue evacuating industry eastward. In the north, defenders of Leningrad held the line against combined forces of Army Group North and Finnish units in Karelia, which reached the city's outskirts by September. Germany's 4th Panzer Group spearheaded the assault but failed to break through. Instead, the Wehrmacht encircled Leningrad, initiating a siege that would last 872 days. Within the city, Red Army troops established a formidable defensive perimeter, significantly reinforced by naval units from the Baltic Fleet and over 135,000 members of the People's Militia. Civilians were issued rifles and immediately deployed to frontline positions. Those who remained in the city soon endured unbearable suffering. Starvation, relentless bombardment, and disease claimed hundreds, then thousands of lives daily. With the city entirely cut off, relief efforts were extremely difficult. Nevertheless, Soviet forces maintained a fragile but vital supply route across Lake Ladoga, the famed Road of Life. This narrow corridor allowed small convoys of supplies to reach the city whenever the lake froze. Though insufficient to meet all needs, these deliveries prevented total collapse throughout the 872-day siege. Meanwhile, the renewed German offensive toward Moscow triggered panic among defenders, a situation Stalin was determined to quash before it spiraled out of control. Since the invasion began, Red Army leadership had been in constant flux. Senior commanders who failed to follow Stalin's directives faced demotion, dismissal, or even execution. This ruthless policy was starkly demonstrated in July with the execution of General Dmitry Pavlov, commander. In late October, the consequences of failure were again made clear when 25 previously arrested officers were summarily executed near Kuybyshev and Saratov. Stalin's harshness reflected his determination to eliminate weakness at one of the war's most critical junctures. The Stavka could not afford incompetent leadership. Delays on the Central Front gave Moscow's reinforced defenses time to form new armies, reorganize logistics, and dig extensive defensive lines around the capital. Stalin appointed General Georgy Zhukov to oversee the city's defense, while hundreds of thousands of reservists and recruits were mobilized nationwide. Several divisions from the Far East were redeployed to bolster the front, though most units defending Moscow were newly formed, reconstituted, or drawn from existing reserves. By early autumn, the Red Army around Moscow was no longer fragmented and reactive. It was dug in, reinforced, and preparing for the coming battle. During these tense months, the changing seasons added new pressure. Autumn brought the infamous Rasputitsa, Russia's seasonal mud, which clogged roads, bogged down vehicles, and slowed all movement along the front. Though miserable, these conditions were far more manageable for the Soviets than for the overextended Germans. Defensive work continued under grueling circumstances as reinforcements and supplies trickled forward. On the home front, the USSR received vital assistance from Western allies thanks to the efforts of Soviet ambassador Maxim Litvinov. In October 1941, the first Lend-Lease Protocol took effect. Though limited in scale at this stage, initial shipments delivered urgently needed raw materials, boots, trucks, and food. Supplies arrived via the Arctic route to Murmansk and Arkhangelsk, where the Soviet Navy played a crucial role in escorting, unloading, and protecting cargoes under. Even as ice thickened and the Luftwaffe patrolled overhead, ship crews and dock workers labored tirelessly to get supplies to the front. Though modest, these deliveries provided a crucial morale boost. By late November, the Rasputitsa froze solid, bringing a new set of challenges. Temperatures plummeted and the front ground to a halt. Soviet troops still suffered from supply shortages, leading to malnutrition, ammunition deficits, frostbite, and even gangrene. However, lessons from the Winter War had taught Soviet commanders to respond swiftly. Red Army transport units employed everything: trains, trucks, horse-drawn carts, reindeer sleds, and even mule caravans to deliver essential supplies from rear depots. The climate offered no inherent advantage, but the Soviets' shorter supply lines allowed them to adapt far more effectively. By early December, Soviet intelligence confirmed that German units were overstretched, undermanned, and incapable of further advance. Months of combat had exhausted the Wehrmacht, and its own logistical failures had strangled its momentum. German forces now stood just kilometers from Moscow's outskirts, exhausted and vulnerable. The Stavka saw its chance. Within days, the Red Army quietly completed its preparations. Over 1 million Soviet troops were assembled across the Western, Kalinin, and Bryansk fronts, with fresh rifle divisions, artillery units, and tank brigades brought to full combat readiness. On December 5, 1941, the Red Army launched a decisive counteroffensive. The initial blows caught the Wehrmacht completely off guard. Coordinated, determined Soviet divisions struck across a broad front, deliberately targeting the enemy's exposed flanks. Over the following weeks, they pushed German forces back 100 to 250 kilometers from the capital. Towns such as Belev, Klin, and Kalinin were swiftly liberated in rapid succession. Morale among Soviet soldiers soared. For the first time since June, the Red Army was dictating the pace of war, seizing the initiative from the enemy. Yet victory was incomplete. German units managed to dig in and establish solid defensive lines, and the front soon stabilized. Nevertheless, the psychological shift was immense. Moscow had been saved from imminent capture. The myth of German invincibility, so carefully cultivated, was shattered. Within the Soviet Union, this triumph became a powerful unifying force, rallying the population against a common threat. Propaganda portrayed the defense of Moscow as irrefutable proof of the Soviet people's extraordinary resilience and Stalin's strategic genius. In reality, it was a brutal, improvised campaign paid for with staggering bloodshed. Since June, the Red Army had suffered over 4.5 million casualties, including 2.3 million soldiers captured and condemned to horrific fates in German POW camps. The price of survival was truly incomprehensible. Yet, against all expectations and predictions, Operation Barbarossa had failed. Moscow still stood, unconquered and defiant. The Red Army, having withstood the fiercest onslaught in modern history, had weathered the storm and altered the course of the war. On the 6th of August 1945, at 8:01 a.m., the world was shaken by an explosion that, in mere seconds, claimed the lives of countless Japanese civilians. That morning became one of the most tragic and harrowing moments in the history of the land of the rising sun. People were heading to work as usual, children were on their way to school, and everyday life bustled through the streets and homes. Suddenly, however, an object appeared in the sky, only to crash to the ground moments later, triggering a colossal explosion. Thick smoke filled the air, a massive fireball engulfed everything, and destruction stretched as far as the eye could see. For an instant, it seemed as if the sun itself had descended upon the earth. At the epicenter of this horrific event, temperatures soared to between 3,000 and 4,000 degrees Celsius. Then, on 9th August 1945, at 11:02 a.m., another devastating blow struck Japan. In the aftermath, Japan was forced to surrender, bringing an end to the Second World War. Thus, humanity encountered for the first time the terrifying destructive power of the atomic bomb, and witnessed the horrifying conclusion of the deadliest conflict in human history. This global war itself had roots in the First World War, raising critical questions. How did it begin? Why did history repeat such a catastrophic conflict? Why is Adolf Hitler widely regarded as the chief instigator of the Second World War? How did Hitler, Nazi ideology, precipitate such a global disaster? And why did the League of Nations, established precisely to preserve world peace, suffer such a catastrophic failure? Known also as the Global War, the Second World War unfolded on an unprecedented scale, drawing in all the world's major powers. Like the First World War, it split the globe into two opposing camps. But whereas the earlier conflict pitted the Allies against the Central Powers, this one, the war was described as total, largely because it involved civilian populations directly. Previously, non-combatants were typically spared from active hostilities, but this conflict showed no mercy. Civilians contributed extensively to national war efforts, leading governments to view ordinary citizens as integral parts of their military machinery. Armies ruthlessly bombed homes, hospitals, shelters, and public spaces to eliminate those supporting the war effort. Every nation mobilized all available resources, economic, industrial, scientific, aerial, and ground forces, against its enemies. Historians disagree on the exact start date. Some cite September 1st, 1939, while others point to the outbreak of the Second Sino-Japanese War in 1937. The conflict ended with the atomic bombings of August 1945 and Japan's formal surrender. An estimated 60 to 80 million people perished, including roughly 50 million civilians and 25 million military personnel, making it the deadliest war in human history. The world divided into two major alliances. The Allies included the United Kingdom, France, the United States, the Soviet Union, China, Poland, Yugoslavia, and Greece. The Axis powers comprised Germany, Italy, and Japan. Notably, Italy had fought alongside the Allies in the First World War, but switched sides due to post-war grievances. Before the First World War, Germany was a powerful, confident nation with a robust economy and formidable military, convinced of its inevitable victory. Yet the Allied powers, the Entente, decisively defeated the Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. The victors imposed harsh terms, particularly on Germany. By late 1918, Germany was a shattered, partitioned state with no choice but to accept the Entente's demands. The war devastated its economy, impoverished it. Deep political, social, and economic upheavals followed. Society split along class lines, unemployment soared, disease spread, and many died of starvation. The government lacked both authority and funds, and foreign powers, especially France, seized key resources. The Treaty of Versailles, signed on 28 June 1919, formalized Germany's defeat with humiliating terms. France, sharing a border with Germany, pushed for the harshest penalties, massive reparations amounting to £6.6 billion, demilitarization of the Rhineland, and the War Guilt Clause, assigning sole blame to Germany. The Rhineland, a strategically vital buffer zone, was to remain permanently free of German troops. These conditions sparked widespread outrage among Germans, fostering a burning desire for revenge. The new Weimar Republic, having no alternative, signed the treaty, thereby earning public resentment and blame for the nation's suffering. As a result, Germany lost all its overseas colonies, 10% of its population, 13% of its territory, 75% of its iron ore, and 26% of its coal reserves. Meanwhile, the League of Nations, founded in 1919 to prevent future wars, proved ineffective. Lacking its own military and undermined by non-participation, the US never joined, and withdrawals, including Germany and the USSR, it failed to stop aggression. Its collapse became a key factor enabling the Second World War. Germany's post-war economic woes were compounded by reparations. Hyperinflation ensued, people needed wheelbarrows of banknotes to buy bread, children played with bundles of cash, and the currency became nearly worthless. In response, the US introduced the Dawes Plan in 1924, stabilizing the economy until 1928. But the 1929 Wall Street crash triggered a global depression. American aid ceased, delivering a double blow to Germany. By 1932, industrial output had dropped by 40%, and desperate citizens marched with signs reading, "Willing to do any work." Public trust in the Weimar government evaporated. Adolf Hitler exploited this chaos. Once an aspiring artist from an ordinary family, he rose by harnessing popular despair. Through charismatic speeches, mass rallies, and relentless propaganda, he promised to overturn the Versailles Treaty, restore Germany's glory, and exact revenge. His Nazi party gained massive support, and on the 30th of January 1933, President Hindenburg appointed him Chancellor. Hitler then pushed through the Enabling Act, granting him dictatorial powers and transforming Germany into a totalitarian state. He swiftly reshaped the nation, withdrew from the League of Nations in 1933, remilitarized the Rhineland in 1936, annexed Austria in 1938, the Anschluss, and occupied Czechoslovakia. To justify invading Poland on the 1st of September 1939, the Nazis staged a false flag attack using German soldiers dressed as Poles. Britain and France, bound by treaty to defend Poland, declared war on the 3rd of September, joined by Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and Canada. Italy and Japan, though former Entente allies, now sided with Germany. Italy felt betrayed after the First World War, its territorial demands ignored, its economy worsened, fueling resentment toward the Allies. Initially, Hitler secured a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union, agreeing to jointly invade and partition Poland. Both powers attacked in September 1939 and divided the country. Outraged, Britain and France rejected Hitler's subsequent peace overtures, ensuring the war's continuation. As Germany expanded westward, the Soviet Union also seized territory, occupying eastern Poland, then the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and invading Finland. This aggression led to the USSR's expulsion from the League of Nations, further exposing the organization's impact. On the other hand, Hitler's ambition to seize ever more territory continued to grow, culminating in the German invasion of Denmark and Norway in April 1940. The primary objective was to secure iron ore supplies from Sweden, which the Allies were attempting to disrupt. In fact, The Allied powers had actively sought ways to halt these shipments, including plans to cut off the flow of Swedish iron ore to Germany, but their efforts failed. Germany swiftly overran both Denmark and Norway. This success, however, heightened German concerns about France's ongoing involvement in the war. Rather than launching a direct assault, Germany devised a strategy reminiscent of World War I, attacking France through Belgium. Italy, aligning itself with Germany, declared war on France on 10 June 1940. By 14 June, German and Italian forces had reached Paris, compelling France to surrender. Just 8 days later, France formally signed an armistice with Germany, acknowledging defeat. Germany's rapid victory over France, achieved in mere weeks, was a stunning military feat that sent shockwaves across the globe. Fear of Hitler spread rapidly. No nation wished to provoke him. His name became synonymous with terror, yet Britain refused to yield. Rejecting Hitler's peace overtures, Britain stood firm, prompting the outbreak of the Battle of Britain in July 1940. The Royal Air Force proved formidable, engaging the Luftwaffe in intense aerial combat. Despite Germany's relentless bombing of British cities, Britain remained defiant. Meanwhile, Hungary, Slovakia and Romania joined the tripartite pact between Germany, Italy and Japan, significantly bolstering the Axis powers. Emboldened by this support, Italy invaded Greece. Britain intervened, successfully repelling Italian forces. In response, Hitler dispatched German troops to aid Italy, leading to a joint Axis. By 1940, Hitler appeared unstoppable, with much of Europe either conquered or aligned with him. At the height of his power, however, he made a fateful error. Convinced of his inevitable victory, he turned toward fulfilling his long-held ambition, the conquest of Eastern Europe, then part of the Soviet Union. In June 1941, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, violating the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Initially, German forces advanced deep into Soviet territory, capturing vast areas. But by December, the brutal Russian winter set in, a condition only the Red Army was prepared to endure. The German offensive stalled, and Soviet counterattacks eventually pushed the Wehrmacht all the way back to Berlin. Hitler's inability to fight a two-front war against Britain in the west and the USSR in the east proved catastrophic. While Europe burned, the United States maintained neutrality, until Japan's surprise attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. This act of aggression drew America into the war, dramatically altering its course. As the tide turned against Germany, Hitler chose to remain in Berlin. Upon learning of Germany's imminent surrender, he committed suicide with his wife, ending the reign of one of history's most dangerous dictators. Germany formally capitulated shortly thereafter. Japan, however, continued to resist. In response, the US made the unprecedented decision to use atomic weapons. On the 6th and 9th of August 1945, American bombers dropped nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, causing unprecedented destruction and loss of life. Japan surrendered on September 2, 1945, bringing World War II to a close. The war left an indelible scar on the world. For the first time, humanity witnessed destruction on such a scale, exacerbated by the horrifying debut of nuclear warfare. In its aftermath, nations raced to develop their own atomic arsenals. Millions had perished. Europe's economy and infrastructure lay in ruins. Even victorious powers faced severe hardship. The US mourned millions of soldiers, while the Soviet Union grappled with immense financial strain, setting the stage for the Cold War that would last until the USSR's collapse. The war also marked the twilight of colonialism. Dictatorships fell in Germany and Italy. Germany itself was divided, the West occupied by the US, Britain, and France, the East controlled by the Soviet Union. Across Asia and Africa, independence movements surged. India, Myanmar, Egypt, the Philippines, Indochina, and Indonesia all sought and eventually achieved self-rule. Economic devastation and mass unemployment prompted the creation of the United Nations, which replaced the ineffective League of Nations and played a vital role in fostering global peace. During the war, India, then under British rule, was automatically drawn into the Allied camp. Approximately 2.5 million Indian soldiers fought against the Axis powers. Of these, around 87,000 died, 34,354 were seriously wounded, and 67,340 were taken prisoner. Echoing patterns from World War I, Britain continued to export Indian food supplies to support its war effort. In Bengal, workers were paid in cash instead of grain, which was shipped overseas. With money but no food available, prices soared, plunging ordinary citizens into crisis. Many rural families were forced to send members into military service, leaving women, children, and the elderly homeless. The result was the devastating Bengal famine of 1943, which claimed an estimated 3 million lives. India had long served as a source of raw materials like jute and cotton for Britain, but the wartime extraction of food exacerbated national hardship. In the war's aftermath, the Quit India movement gained unstoppable momentum. Weakened by global conflict and unable to suppress mass resistance, Britain finally granted India independence in August 1947. World War II undoubtedly stands apart in the annals of human history as the largest and most destructive conflict ever waged. Like a merciless whirlwind, it swept across every continent, leaving behind millions of shattered lives and shaping the world we know today. But what caused this outcome? Why did the Allies prevail? Or perhaps a more fitting question would be, why did the Axis powers collapse? By delving into the archives of World War II, we embark on a journey through pivotal events, turning points, and the fates of individuals who determined the outcome of this global drama. Our story begins in the 1920s. At that time, 6 great powers dominated the international stage, but 2 stood out unmistakably as true global superpowers, both of which would later join the Allied cause. Great Britain, mistress of the seas, ruled the largest empire in history, its mighty navy commanding the oceans without rival. The United States, meanwhile, was the wealthiest nation on Earth and the financial hub of the planet. Yet in 1929, the world changed beyond recognition. The global economy collapsed into the depths of crisis, and both Britain and the US effectively withdrew from the world stage. In this chaos, nationalist governments sprang up worldwide like mushrooms after rain, most prominently in Germany and Japan. Their new leaders harbored grand ambitions to build empires from which they could draw resources and elevate themselves to superpower status. Crucially, they were prepared to go to war to realize this vision. In stark contrast, the policies of Britain, France, and the United States were bent on avoiding war at all costs. The US passed neutrality laws, obliging it to stay out of any future conflict, while Britain pursued a strategy famously known as appeasement. Though widely here in the World War II galleries, you can see the Anglo-German Declaration signed by Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain and Adolf Hitler, a document drafted after the Munich Conference, where Britain and France agreed to Hitler's annexation of German-speaking regions of Czechoslovakia in the hope of preserving peace. Chamberlain genuinely believed this agreement would secure peace for our time. Less than a year later, however, he would declare war on Germany. This new era of conflict had actually begun in 1931, when Japan invaded Manchuria and soon became embroiled in a full-scale war with China. Japanese forces advanced rapidly, but the vastness of Chinese territory and fierce resistance denied them lasting control. By 1939, Japan's military resources were exhausted. During this time, Japanese troops committed countless atrocities against civilians they deemed racially inferior. Up to 20 million Chinese perished during World War II. Meanwhile, in Europe, Germany began rebuilding its military might and expanding its territory, first the Rhineland, then Austria, and in 1938, the Sudetenland. It was at this moment that Hitler signed the aforementioned Anglo-German Declaration, assuring the world his ambitions were satisfied. Yet the following year, he annexed the rest of Czechoslovakia, an act that proved decisive. Despite their military unpreparedness, Britain and France now pledged to defend Poland. When Germany invaded in September 1939, Europe was plunged into total war. Then, in a shocking turn, the Soviet Union joined forces with Germany to invade Poland from the east. Though communist Soviets and fascist Germans were ideological enemies, they temporarily set aside their differences in 1939 to 1940 to redraw the map of Europe. The Soviets occupied the Baltic states. Meanwhile, Germany captured Denmark and Norway before achieving one of the war's most stunning victories. Using advanced blitzkrieg tactics, German forces overran France and the Low Countries in just 6 weeks. Britain now stood dangerously exposed. During the evacuation from Dunkirk, British troops escaped aboard small civilian vessels, but left behind nearly all their heavy equipment. It seemed the German war machine was unstoppable, and Britain stood alone, isolated and vulnerable. Yet this was not entirely true. Britain received crucial support from its empire and dominions, from the United States and from governments in exile based in London. Germany expected Britain to surrender, but to Hitler's dismay, the new British Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, resolved to fight on. Britain still held key defensive advantages: the English Channel as a vital barrier, the Royal Navy, though stretched thin, remained the world's largest, and the Royal Air Force possessed a sophisticated air defense network and modern fighter aircraft. Together, they kept Germany at bay and thwarted any invasion. Britain remained in the war. It was then that Germany, Japan, and Italy formalized their alliance, becoming the Axis powers. At that moment, their prospects appeared promising. Beneath the surface, however, serious problems festered. Italy's attempt to build a new Roman Empire in North Africa and the Balkans floundered. Its invasions of Greece and Egypt ended in failure. Germany's newly acquired European territories were blockaded by the Royal Navy, and critical supplies dwindled. In fact, Germany faced such severe shortages of food and oil that its pact with the Soviet Union was the only thing keeping it afloat. !@META, pause, sex, 2.0. Similarly, Japan's 1940 occupation of French Indochina, aimed at cutting off Chinese supply lines, triggered furious reactions from the United States, was already shaping the war's course. Japanese brutality in China had outraged American public opinion, shifting sentiment decisively. In response to Japan's move into Indochina, the US imposed an embargo on oil and steel exports. When Britain and the Netherlands followed suit, Japan suddenly lost access to 94% of its imported oil. At the same time, the US was rapidly expanding its military capacity. Though still neutral on paper, it was already supplying vital war materiel exclusively to the Allies. The Lend-Lease Act soon formalized this support, enabling the free transfer of aircraft, ships, food, and clothing. This flood of American aid became a formidable challenge for the Axis. Under mounting pressure, both Japan and Germany faced existential threats. Japan risked running out of oil and losing the war in China, while Germany feared the growing power of its old rival, the Soviet Union. Stalemate was no longer an option. In 1941, both powers chose to gamble everything. Despite their vulnerabilities, they escalated the war in a desperate bid to seize the resources they needed. In June 1941, Germany betrayed its Soviet ally and launched the largest invasion force in military history into the USSR. Victory required a swift, lightning campaign, but Nazi ideology dismissed Slavic peoples as racially inferior, leading to a catastrophic underestimation of Soviet resilience. Hitler famously declared, "We need only kick in the door and the whole rotten structure will collapse." This arrogance would prove fatal. The Soviets mobilized on an unprecedented scale, relocating entire factories beyond the Ural Mountains to sustain war production, churning out weapons like the M30 howitzer to repel the invaders. Soviet citizens sacrificed their lives in staggering numbers. Ultimately, 25 million perished in what they called the Great Patriotic War. Germany needed a quick victory. By December 1941, the German advance stalled just miles from Moscow. Their grand gamble had failed. Almost simultaneously, Japan launched its own offensive, not against the Soviets, but toward resource-rich Southeast Asia. Recognizing that such a move would inevitably draw the US into the war, Japan struck first, with a surprise attack on the US Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. The assault succeeded, and Japan swiftly seized control of the territories and resources it coveted. Believing Americans to be soft and unwilling to endure heavy losses, Japanese leaders hoped fierce defense of these gains would force the US to negotiate. Instead, the attack united the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union in a common resolve. Only the unconditional surrender of the Axis would be acceptable. After Pearl Harbor, American isolationism vanished overnight. Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin agreed on a strategy of relentless attrition, on land, sea, and in the air, leveraging their overwhelming advantages in manpower, material, and industrial capacity. The ungainly-looking B-24 Liberator bomber, on display nearby, embodied this industrial might. At its peak, the Willow Run plant in Michigan produced one B-24 every 63 minutes. The tide of war was turning. By 1942, Allied codebreakers had penetrated German and Japanese ciphers, enabling critical victories. At the Battle of Midway, US aircraft sank 4 Japanese carriers, crippling Japan's offensive naval power. On the Eastern Front, Germany's last desperate push to capture the Caucasus oil fields was shattered at Stalingrad, the war's bloodiest battle, where Soviet forces encircled and annihilated an entire German army. The Axis had gambled on quick triumphs. Instead, they found themselves trapped in a war of attrition they could not win. Now the Allies set out to convert the so-called Battle of the Atlantic was not a single clash like Trafalgar, but a grueling, years-long struggle. Germany deployed U-boats to starve Britain into submission, sinking millions of tons of Allied shipping, losses that peaked in 1942 during what German submariners called their second happy time. But the Allies turned the tide. They replaced losses with mass-produced Liberty ships, 3 every 2 days at peak output, and refined convoy tactics with better naval escorts. Technological innovations followed. Long-range aircraft like the Liberator closed the Atlantic air gap. Sonar and radar tracked submarines, and weapons like the Hedgehog mortar destroyed them. By 1943, the Allies had decisively won the Battle of the Atlantic, tightening a noose of blockade around the Axis. As Japan tried to ferry resources from its new empire back to the home islands, American submarines and aircraft mercilessly hunted its convoys. Fuel shortages became critical, forcing Japan to shorten pilot training, a fatal flaw that left its aviators easy prey for better trained Allied crews. Allied forces now launched coordinated offensives, island hopping across the Pacific toward Japan, liberating Ukraine and knocking Italy out of the war. These advances brought them within striking distance of the Axis heartlands, enabling devastating air campaigns. British and American air forces subjected Nazi Germany to round-the-clock bombing, the RAF by night flattening urban centers, the US Army Air Forces by day precision striking industrial targets. Losses were heavy. Here you can see the tail section of a German Bf-110 night fighter flown by ace Heinz Wolfgang Schnaufer, who shot down 121 unescorted British bombers. Yet the bombing campaign forced Germany to disperse aircraft production across countless small factories, sacrificing efficiency. Luftwaffe fighters were lured into the air by decoy bomber formations, escort fighters. In this war of exhaustion, the Allies prevailed. American bombers also unleashed firestorms on Japan, using incendiary weapons to reduce entire cities to ashes. Hundreds of thousands of Axis civilians perished in these strategic bombing campaigns. 1944 also marked the peak of the Holocaust, the Nazi regime's monstrous campaign to exterminate Europe's Jews. 6 million Jews were starved, shot, or worked to death in a grotesque system that fed Germany's warped war economy. That summer, the Allies landed in Normandy on D-Day, beginning the liberation of Western Europe. Simultaneously, the Soviet Union launched Operation Bagration, a colossal offensive that shattered German forces in the east. Both campaigns succeeded spectacularly. The Allies not only outnumbered the Germans in troops and tanks, but also enjoyed superior logistics, supplying their armies with trucks, while the Axis still relied heavily on horse-drawn transport. Allied leadership had learned the lessons of modern warfare. Early in the war, the Germans had empowered frontline commanders with significant autonomy, a doctrine that delivered stunning success in the 1940 campaign against France. For comparison, Stalin appointed himself Supreme Commander-in-Chief of the Soviet forces. His epaulets are displayed here. However, as the war progressed, Stalin increasingly trusted the counsel of his generals, a shift that led to improved military outcomes. Meanwhile, Hitler moved in the opposite direction. he became ever more convinced of his own strategic genius. "I walk the path dictated by Providence with the confidence of a sleepwalker," he declared. Hitler repeatedly denied his field commanders requests for strategic withdrawals, a policy that had catastrophic consequences for the German army. As a result, the Allies steadily gained ground. The war's outcome was essentially decided, yet the most striking manifestation of this refusal was the self-sacrifice of young Japanese pilots ordered to crash their explosives-laden aircraft into Allied naval vessels, a tactic known as kamikaze attacks. This relentless determination to fight to the death stemmed from a deep-seated belief that surrender was dishonorable. Consequently, suffering and bloodshed continued unabated. Adolf Hitler pinned his hopes on German Vergeltungswaffen, vengeance weapons, such as the Phi-1 rocket displayed here. He believed the destruction and civilian casualties inflicted by these weapons would terrorize Allied populations and compel their leaders to sue for peace. This, however, was a grave miscalculation. Vast resources diverted to Phi weapon production came at the expense of urgently needed tanks and fighter aircraft. Moreover, tens of thousands of forced laborers perished under horrific conditions in underground factories while building these weapons. In stark contrast, the Allies invested heavily in developing an entirely new, era-defining weapon of decisive impact, the atomic bomb. By May 1945, crushed between advancing forces from the east and west, Germany was forced to capitulate. Japan, however, fought on, until the United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the Soviet Union invaded Manchuria. It then became unmistakably clear that further resistance was futile. In August 1945, World War II ended in Allied victory. The Allies possessed overwhelming advantages in natural resources and population, fundamental pillars of total war. Yet this superiority alone did not guarantee victory. Through indomitable spirit and tenacious resistance, they overcame early setbacks to persevere. They coordinated a vast strategic framework and, often through painful experience, mastered the demands of modern warfare. They also successfully mobilized their populations for immense effort and sacrifice. The peoples of the Allied nations demonstrated unwavering resolve and resilience, whether fighting the Axis powers, manufacturing the countless items required by mechanized warfare, or serving in numerous support roles. On Victory Day, Churchill addressed crowds in London with the words, "This is your victory." The Second World War was undoubtedly the largest, most destructive and bloodiest conflict in human history, leaving an indelible mark on every continent, including even distant Antarctica. Fighting erupted across the globe, from the fields of China and France to the exotic shores of Hawaii, icy Iceland, scorching Somalia, picturesque Sri Lanka, the harsh Arctic, and countless other regions. Warfare unfolded in trenches, on horseback, in the boundless skies, beneath ocean depths, and, for the first time in human history, even reached into outer space and involved nuclear weapons, forever transforming humanity's understanding of war. This global conflict radically reshaped the world order. Powerful European empires, British, French, Dutch, and others never fully recovered from the blows they sustained. The remainder of the 20th century came to be dominated by two new superpowers, the United States of America and the Soviet Union, which dictated the geopolitical landscape for decades. In Asia, the war ultimately led to the triumph of the Chinese Communist Party, the dramatic division of Korea into two spheres of influence, and the birth of India as an independent nation. This raises several natural questions. When exactly did this monumental event take place? What were its key phases? And who were the main adversaries on the battlefields? Answering these questions is essential to understanding modern history. The precise start date of the Second World War depends on one's perspective. The conflict stemmed from deep-seated ambitions to expand empires, seize territory, assert dominance, accumulate wealth, and control resources. Three dictatorships, Germany, Italy, and Japan, collectively known as the Axis powers, aggressively expanded their domains throughout the 1930s. Germany saw dominance in Europe. Japan and China had already been locked in fierce combat since 1937, and some historians regard this as the true beginning of the war. The United States was effectively drawn into the war in the Pacific in December 1941, following Japan's surprise attack on the American fleet at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Thus, for Americans, the war began in 1941. However, Europeans, Canadians, Australians, Indians, and residents of other European colonies, which constituted the vast majority of the world's population at the time, marked the war's start in September 1939. That month, Adolf Hitler, Germany's dictator, invaded Poland. In response, numerous countries declared war on Germany, marking the official beginning of the Second World War in Europe. The war's end is somewhat clearer. Germany and Japan suffered crushing defeats and were occupied in 1945. But why is September 1939 so pivotal? In Europe, Hitler's Nazi Party had seized power in Germany, dismantling democratic institutions and establishing a totalitarian regime. Under his rule, political opponents, Jews and other minorities were persecuted and concentration camps were built. Hitler's central goal was territorial expansion, specifically reclaiming lands lost after Germany's defeat in the First World War in 1918. In 1938, he annexed Austria and then seized parts of Czechoslovakia. Yet, his ambitions stretched far beyond. He dreamed of a vast Eastern Empire encompassing Ukraine's fertile farmland and the oil fields of the Caucasus. Claiming that Western Poland had historically belonged to Germany, Hitler targeted it next. To secure his eastern flank, he signed a non-aggression pact with Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin in August 1939. Secretly, they agreed to invade and partition Poland between them. On September 1st, 1936 2.0. Hitler assumed Britain and France would tolerate this, as they had reluctantly accepted the annexation of Austria and parts of Czechoslovakia over the previous 2 years. But the invasion of Poland was the final straw. They declared war on Germany. Hitler was now embroiled in another world war. What now? He reportedly asked his foreign minister. Britain and France were soon joined by their vast empires: Canada, India, Nigeria, South Africa, New Zealand, Australia, and many others, all now drawn into the conflict. Events unfolded rapidly. Germany and the Soviet Union swiftly divided Poland. British and French forces offered little effective aid. A minor French incursion into Western Germany advanced only a few miles before retreating once victorious German troops returned from Poland. The Soviets fared poorly in their own invasion of Finland, suffering a humiliating setback, though they later seized a small portion of Finnish territory in 1940. At sea, German U-boats and warships targeted British shipping in what became known as the Battle of the Atlantic, a campaign that lasted until the war's final days. Just hours after hostilities began, a German submarine sank the passenger liner Athenia. Meanwhile, any German naval vessel venturing into open waters was hunted down. The British Royal Navy famously sank the German cruiser Admiral Graf Spee off the coast of South America. On the European continent, however, a tense lull, dubbed the Phony War, prevailed. Both sides watched each other across the Franco-German border. In Britain, more civilians died in road accidents due to blackout conditions than soldiers did in combat. But this stalemate shattered in April 1940. Both the Allies and Germany moved to invade Norway to secure its vital resources, particularly iron ore and oil shipped through the port of Narvik. Germany swiftly overran Denmark in hours and launched a naval invasion of Norway, evading the British fleet partly thanks to poor weather. Allied attempts to reinforce Norwegian forces failed. By late May, the last Allied troops and the Norwegian royal family were evacuated. The defeat sparked political crisis in Britain, leading to the collapse of the government and the rise of a new Prime Minister, Winston Churchill. Churchill had barely assumed office when, on the very day he moved into 10 Downing Street, German forces launched a massive invasion of Western Europe. Huge German armies poured across the borders of Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Belgium, and France. What followed was one of the most dramatic military collapses in history. Employing tanks, aircraft, and motorized units in a revolutionary tactic later dubbed Blitzkrieg, Lightning War, the Germans achieved a stunning breakthrough. While Allied forces advanced into Belgium, expecting a repeat of the static trench warfare of World War I, the Germans struck unexpectedly through the Ardennes forest, a region most strategists considered impassable for large armored formations. This surprise maneuver split the Allied armies in two. Within 10 days, German forces reached the English Channel, cutting off all northern Allied troops in Belgium from the main French army to the south. Trapped, British and French forces retreated to the coastal town of Dunkirk. In a desperate evacuation, the Royal Navy mobilized not only warships but also civilian vessels, fishing boats, pleasure craft, river barges, to rescue soldiers directly from the beaches, as port facilities had been heavily damaged. The British initially hoped to save 45,000 men over 2 days. But Hitler unexpectedly ordered his advancing panzers to halt, concerned about overextended supply lines and unsuitable marshy terrain near Dunkirk. In just 1 week, an astonishing 340,000 Allied troops were rescued, many calling it a miracle. Britain had saved its army, though it left behind nearly all its heavy equipment. Seizing the moment, Italy, Hitler's Axis partner, declared war and invaded southern France. After Dunkirk, German forces turned south and crushed the remaining French army. Within weeks, France fell. Hitler visited Paris for propaganda photographs. Germany now dominated Western and Central Europe. Inspired by Churchill's defiant speeches, Britain and its empire resolved never to surrender. Hitler now faced a British problem. He had to either force Britain into peace or destroy it entirely. Otherwise, The British would continue harassing him while he turned east to realize his ultimate ambition, conquering the Soviet Union and building a vast German empire. Hitler ordered preparations for an invasion of Britain while using the Luftwaffe to bomb the country into submission. Thus began the Battle of Britain, the first major campaign fought almost entirely in the air. German bombers initially targeted Royal Air Force, RAF, airfields and infrastructure, aiming to achieve air superiority before launching mass terror raids on cities. But the RAF proved remarkably resilient. Hurricanes and Spitfires fiercely contested every raid. German bomber losses mounted to unsustainable levels. The British employed a pioneering radar system to detect incoming raids and direct fighter squadrons with unprecedented efficiency. As summer wore on, the RAF seemed invincible. Frustrated, the Germans shifted tactics in early September, bombing London in hopes of breaking civilian morale. This marked the start of the Blitz, sustained aerial bombing of British cities. Yet by mid-September, it was clear the Luftwaffe had failed. The RAF remained a potent force, and the cost of bombing London was too high. Hitler admitted he, without neutralizing the RAF and the Royal Navy ready to annihilate any invasion fleet, he shelved plans for a cross-channel invasion. Night bombing of cities continued, but Operation Sea Lion was indefinitely postponed. While Britain fought for survival at home, it also battled Italian forces in the Mediterranean, where colonial territories clashed in North and East Africa. British forces successfully liberated Italian-occupied Ethiopia, but fighting in Libya and Egypt proved far more grueling and prolonged. 1941 became a decisive year as Axis and British forces clashed with increasing intensity in North Africa. Meanwhile, Italy's ill-fated invasion of Greece in late 1940 collapsed into humiliating retreats, forcing Mussolini to beg Hitler for help. The Führer could not let his allies' failure tarnish the Axis image, so he invaded the Balkans, swiftly occupying Yugoslavia and Greece by April 1941. But this diversion cost the Axis precious time and resources, just as they were preparing for their most ambitious operation yet, the invasion of the Soviet Union. In June 1941, Hitler shocked his former ally Stalin by launching Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in history. Nearly 4 million Axis troops, 3,500 tanks, over 8,000 vehicles, thousands of aircraft, and more than 500,000 horses surged across the Soviet frontier. The Red Army was caught completely off guard. Millions of Soviet soldiers were killed or captured. Most prisoners perished in horrific conditions. Even Stalin's own son died in German captivity. By December, German spearheads stood on the outskirts of Moscow. But fierce Soviet resistance and the brutal Russian winter halted the advance. The Soviets then launched a powerful counteroffensive, pushing the Germans back from the capital. Hitler had believed that by kicking in the door, the entire rotten structure. Instead, Soviet forces retreated but did not break, setting the stage for a protracted and catastrophic war of attrition. As German troops closed in on Stalin's capital, a sudden attack erupted on the other side of the world. Japan, locked in a war with China and desperate for victory, urgently needed raw materials such as rubber and oil, which were abundant in Southeast Asia, particularly in places like Malaya. Japanese military planners anticipated that the United States would oppose any invasion of these territories. Consequently, they decided to launch a preemptive strike to neutralize the US Pacific Fleet, thereby securing a free hand to seize the resources they coveted. In early December 1941, 6 Japanese aircraft carriers steamed toward the Hawaiian Islands. On December 7, 1941, they launched their attack. Bombs and torpedoes rained down on the US at Meta, quote, pause quote, colon, quote, sex, quote, colon, 2.0, Pacific Fleet, headquarters at Pearl Harbor on the island of Oahu. 8 battleships were sunk or damaged, and 2,500 Americans lost their lives. President Roosevelt called the day a date which will live in infamy, and declared war on Japan. Remarkably, Adolf Hitler then declared war on the United States. America thus entered the conflict against both Japan and Germany, merging the wars in Europe and Asia into a truly global conflagration. Simultaneously with the Pearl Harbor assault, Japanese forces invaded British-controlled Malaya, followed by Indonesia and the Philippines. Within months, all these territories had fallen under Japanese control. The year 1942 proved pivotal. It began with Axis advances, but ended in devastating defeats. Japan expanded its reach across Asia and the Pacific, capturing Burma, advancing toward India's borders, and even bombing Australia and Ceylon, now Sri Lanka. Meanwhile, German and Axis forces surged through Ukraine into southern Russia, reaching. However, their offensive stalled amid brutal urban combat as they struggled to secure the city. That same summer, Japan suffered a catastrophic naval defeat. Having broken Japanese naval codes, the Americans laid a trap near Midway Island. US carrier-based dive bombers sank 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, delivering a crippling blow to the core of Japan's naval power. The tide of war had turned. A similar shift occurred in North Africa. After a dramatic Axis advance deep into Egypt threatened Britain's entire Middle Eastern position, British forces counterattacked at El Alamein in October and pushed the Axis back, a turning point that began a long retreat. Days later, American troops made their first appearance in the European theater, joining British forces in landings in Morocco and Algeria. This move threatened to trap Axis forces between the advancing British army from Egypt and the new Allied front in the west. In November 1942, Soviet forces launched a massive counteroffensive against the Germans at Stalingrad. Within days, the German Sixth Army was encircled. Despite desperate resistance, the last remnants surrendered in February 1943, a crushing defeat for Nazi Germany. In 1943, the Allies intensified their aerial campaign over Europe. Night after night, fleets of bombers struck German cities and industrial centers. In a daring May raid, British bombers breached key dams in the Ruhr Valley, disrupting hydroelectric power and water supplies in Germany's industrial heartland. On the Eastern Front, Germany launched its final major offensive near Kursk. However, British intelligence, having decrypted German communications, provided Stalin with detailed intelligence. The Soviets constructed formidable defensive lines that inflicted horrific losses on the attackers before launching a powerful counteroffensive that in the Atlantic, Allied navies, British, American, Canadian, and others, developed effective tactics to counter the U-boat threat. In a series of decisive engagements, they sank German submarines in such numbers that German admirals suspended all submarine operations. The U-boats would never regain the upper hand. By spring 1943, Axis forces in North Africa surrendered. In July, the Allies invaded Sicily, the first foothold on Axis home territory. Later that month, Italian dictator Benito Mussolini was deposed and arrested. In early September, Allied forces landed on mainland Italy. Although Italy agreed to surrender, German troops swiftly took control of the country, forcing the Allies into a grueling, slow advance up the Italian peninsula. In the Pacific, the United States shifted to the offensive, executing a two-pronged, island-hopping campaign. One thrust moved through the South Pacific, securing New Guinea and nearby islands. The other advanced through the Central Pacific, capturing the Gilbert and Marshall Islands. The Axis was in full retreat. Victory was no longer within their grasp. As Germany's situation deteriorated, its genocidal campaign against European Jews and other targeted groups accelerated. Millions were murdered in industrialized death camps across the shrinking Nazi empire. By 1944, the noose tightened around the Axis powers. The Soviet Union launched a series of massive offensives involving millions of soldiers, steadily driving Axis forces westward through brutal, large-scale battles. By year's end, Soviet troops had crossed into Germany itself. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, the US inflicted successive defeats on Japan. Much of its navy was destroyed in major sea battles like the Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf. American forces methodically seized key islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, establishing air bases from which long-range bombers could strike the Japanese. In a desperate and largely ineffective measure, Japan launched incendiary balloons toward North America. One such device killed 6 civilians in Oregon, the only US mainland casualties of Axis action during the war. Japanese forces also attempted an invasion of India, but were decisively halted at the battles of Kohima and Imphal and forced into retreat. On June 6, 1944, D-Day, American, British, Canadian, and Allied forces launched the long-awaited invasion of Western Europe. Within 24 hours, some 150,000 troops landed in Normandy. Paratroopers dropped behind enemy lines, while the bulk crossed the English Channel in over 7,000 vessels to storm the beaches. Fierce resistance from German defenders in fortified bunkers made progress agonizingly slow on some sectors, but by day's end, the Allies had secured a foothold. Over the following days, vast quantities of troops and equipment poured ashore. German reinforcements rushed to Normandy, triggering a brutal battle of attrition. Not until early August did the Allies break out decisively, sweeping across northern France and liberating Paris by month's end. Victory seemed imminent. The Allies then attempted an ambitious airborne operation to seize bridges over the Rhine at Arnhem, but the Germans, though weakened, fought back fiercely and thwarted the plan. The war dragged into another horrific winter. In December, Hitler launched his last major offensive through the snow-covered Ardennes forest in Belgium and Luxembourg. Though the attack created a bulge in Allied lines, it failed to achieve a breakthrough. Reinforcements flooded the region, and the Battle of the Bulge ended in yet another German defeat, one that cost them irreplaceable troops, tanks, and fuel. All these events culminated in 1945. Yet the Axis powers fought on to the bitter end, inflicting immense, unnecessary... When the snows melted in spring, Allied forces surged through northern Italy, completing its liberation. On the Western Front, retreating Germans blew up one of their largest dams to flood the countryside and slow the Allied advance. But by March, Western forces had crossed the Rhine and pushed deep into Germany. By April, they stood just 50 miles from Berlin. In the east, the Soviets advanced relentlessly through Poland and eastern Germany. With nearly 2.5 million troops, they overwhelmed German defenses. Stalin, desperate to reach Berlin before the Western Allies, urged his generals forward. and they succeeded. By late April, Berlin was encircled. On 30 April, Hitler married his longtime companion Eva Braun, then killed her and committed suicide. Admiral Karl Dönitz, his short-lived successor as Führer, surrendered unconditionally on May 7th. The war in Europe was over. Some 43 million people had perished. 2/3 of Europe's Jews had been exterminated. Cities lay in ruins, cultural treasures destroyed, and the continent was left shattered. Japan, however, continued to resist. Its cities burned, its empire in ruins. American forces drew ever closer to the home islands. After horrific battles on Iwo Jima and Okinawa, where Japanese defenders employed suicidal but futile tactics, plans were drawn up for a full-scale invasion of Japan itself. But then, the United States stunned the world. A single aircraft dropped the most powerful weapon ever created, the atomic bomb. This wonder weapon was the product of a massive, secret American scientific and industrial effort, the Manhattan Project, to harness atomic energy. A successful test in July 1945 turned a stretch of New Mexico desert into glass. In August, President Harry S. Truman, having assumed office after Roosevelt's death in April, authorized the use of the bomb to. On the 6th of August, Hiroshima was obliterated. 3 days later, Nagasaki suffered the same fate. Hundreds of thousands were killed or grievously wounded. Simultaneously, the Soviet Union finally entered the Pacific War. The day after Hiroshima, Stalin launched a massive invasion of Japanese-held Manchuria. Faced with overwhelming force on two fronts, the Japanese government capitulated. The formal surrender ceremony took place on September 2, 1945, aboard an American battleship in Tokyo Bay. World War II was over. The world that emerged was irrevocably transformed. In Europe, Eastern territories fell under Soviet communist control, redrawing the geopolitical map. Germany, once Europe's powerhouse, was split. The East occupied by the Soviet Union, the West by Western democracies. The United States, now a nuclear superpower, assumed global dominance, eclipsing the war-exhausted British and French empires. In Asia, Japan underwent sweeping reconstruction under American occupation. Korea, like Germany, was divided, the South aligned with democracies, the North under communist rule. Vietnam, having shaken off French colonial authority during the war, entered a new phase of conflict as France attempted to reassert control. China, ravaged by years of warfare, became the stage for a renewed civil war, which by 1949 resulted in communist forces taking control of the mainland. We still live in a world profoundly shaped by the consequences of World War II. Its echoes continue to resonate through the politics, borders, and alliances of our time. In May 1940, Nazi Germany launched a massive offensive on the Western Front. Despite the combined forces of France, Great Britain, Belgium, and the Netherlands significantly outnumbering the Germans in manpower, artillery, and tanks, and despite the French army being widely regarded as one of the finest in the world, German forces stunned the world by achieving a crushing victory over the Allies in just 6 weeks. This raises a natural question. How did Germany manage such a decisive and rapid triumph? When Germany invaded Poland in 1939, Britain and France declared war. Yet the Western Allies remained largely passive observers, while German and Soviet forces crushed Polish resistance. Meanwhile, German Chancellor Adolf Hitler was already planning his next move. He was in a hurry. His temporary pact with the USSR might not last, and the Allies were not yet ready for full-scale war. On September 27th, Hitler informed the High Command of his intention to attack France within a month. Most German generals, including Wilhelm Ritter von Leeb, were stunned. General von Leeb voiced his concerns. The French won't be caught off guard. They know full well that if the Germans strike, it will be through Belgium. Therefore, they will be on high alert. Our losses will be enormous. An attack on France cannot be carried out as it was in Poland. It will be extremely costly and bloody. Hitler ignored these warnings and ordered planning to begin for an offensive aimed at seizing neutral Belgium and the Netherlands and occupying enough of northern France to establish a springboard for an assault on Britain. The original attack date was postponed to November 25th. Army Chief of Staff Franz Halder swiftly prepared a cautious plan centered on a main thrust through central Belgium. Hitler, however, expressed disappointment, declaring, "This is just the old Schlieffen plan, with a strong right wing along the Atlantic coast." Negotiations between army planners and Hitler dragged on for months, during which the offensive was delayed 29 times. Increasingly, Hitler favored concentrating Germany's relatively few armored and motorized divisions for a breakthrough through the densely forested Ardennes region, aiming to cut off Allied forces should they, as expected, advance into Belgium. The army leadership considered this approach excessively risky. Unknown to Hitler, General Erich von Manstein also advocated an Ardennes route for what would later become known as the Sickle Cut plan, but the army command rejected it. Then, in January 1940, a German Messerschmitt Bf 108 Typhoon carrying the invasion plans crashed in Belgium, forcing the Germans to revise their strategy again. Finally, on February 24, 1940, the final plan was approved, one that modified Manstein's original double envelopment concept. Under it, Army Group B would pin Allied forces in the north, while the Southern Army Group A would spearhead the attack through the Ardennes, cross the Meuse River at Sedan, and race toward Abbeville, where the Somme meets the sea. It was a daring plan, requiring valuable armored units to navigate treacherous, narrow forest roads and advance with dangerously exposed flanks. General Fedor von Bock, commander of Army Group B, voiced his misgivings to Halder. "You'll be crawling 10 miles from Cedar for the following. You will be the plan and well-informed Detli in this appearing the most of example of this. You'll be crawling 10 miles from the Maginot Line with your breakthrough flank exposed, hoping the French will just sit and watch. You're cramming masses of tanks onto the sparse roads of the Ardennes as if air power doesn't exist. And then you expect to push all the way to the coast with a 200-mile-long open southern